Blow my nose one more time. Oh, okay. Hmm. Hmm. Yes, I suppose so. Hmm. Okay. Hmm. All right. All right. All right. Well, just a note from the start. I bring to this subject a great deal of questions or thoughts or themes which may have been a long time coming, a long time percolating, you see, a long time in potential and sometimes held in stasis. And sometimes when they approach my subject matter this evening, such as the thought of Meister Eckhart, the things begin to the hounds begin to tug at their leashes, you see, and the birds of appetite begin to want to fly in strange formations. And so, but this is part of our natural, the natural multiplicity that we have in our artistic conceptual imaginations when we approach the subject matter of Meister Eckhart. And so, with that in mind, with that in mind, actually, um, here are a certain kind of invocation, symbolically speaking, of course, the image of an invocation of of some of the subjects which we will be able to catch on the wing, some of the themes which we will be able to catch on the wing. So this poem, written by myself, um, announces some of the themes in a certain way. The title is From Hegel to Birmingham: Theories of Analogy Support Foundational Questions in Multiplicative Infinities that can only be asked or answered in time-tempered yet God-given spaces of intellect and mercy, the cowcatcher of peaceful intention, the Trinity as an image in the soul where triunal forms achieve unicity in the city of one municipality, a very simple metropolis, yet each one breathes, whose meaning is this way, whose meaning is this way. So, some preliminary parameters then are suggested to us. It's the last time, perhaps, probably, you will hear either of Hegel or Birmingham, because our subject is a different kind of philosopher of the spirit, and that is Meister Eckhart. But some preliminary kind of like passageways or boundaries. Okay, let's look at, first of all, okay, Meister Eckhart is a bringer to us of a certain kind of literary form, a literary formation, this kind of dense theological rhetoric. But I must say it is also poet speech because it is uttered out of the immediate needs of the community. Meister Eckhart was a preacher. He was a Dominican. They are a teaching order and a preaching order. And as such, his intellectual background reflects all that. And yet at the same time, and this is, it could be the heart of a certain kind of message also. The utterance is taking place within Meister Eckhart, within the individual. The utterance is taking place deeply within. The utterance is taking place within, on a particular ground, which can only be itself. We could begin to speak of it in agricultural terms when we speak of like the ground, and we could speak of the seed, and we could speak of all these primordial terms, because, the theology, utters itself forth in these incarnational ways. And that is understood even by medieval Dominicans, despite their reputation. And Meister Eckhard, is perhaps an exception, right? Like all great thinkers are, to their times and to their immediate, quote unquote backgrounds, they are exceptions. But at the same time, there are these homely metaphors, these agricultural metaphors, these immediate phenomena surrounding those who live close to the soil. For these are these are the ones amongst whom the child of God appears, according to the myth, and the background of the poetic background of what Meister Eckhart is speaking of to the people. In his sermons, I'm talking about in a certain way, his sermons in German, spoken to the people, because the learning in the academies, of course, is Latin. And a book seems to have fallen off the shelf over there right when I was saying this. Is that something or other? No, it's just a distracting sound. But even so, this is part of the spoken word event, which is what Meister Eckhart in his sermons is bringing forth in the language of the people to the people in the churches, which is where they are gathering. And so it's a different kind of thing than is happening in the quote-unquote ivory tower, or in the cloister, and the monastery, or even, dare I say it, in the scriptorium. It is something that is happening amongst the people. So there is a mixture of idioms, as well as, a rebirthing of Meister Eckhart's poetic message, or poetic grace or feeling or gift, a rebirthing of that, from the Latin in which it percolated itself into the vernacular language. And when that happens, this has always been the case, when that happens, that is when steps are taken in the arts of literature. And so, putting it under the general heading of poetry, then we can approach it this way, and we can see it this way. The relation between the Latin and the vernacular language. The sermons in German, which is where some of his message can be given, in terms that actually we can approach and come to understand in a way that might be warmer and more intimate to us. In mythical images that are actually more familiar to all of us than sometimes seems to be the case. So let's open up then with a sermon, with some of what I'm talking about, a sample of his speech, in other words. This is a sample of the speech of Meister Eckhart. This is taken from a period of time when his literary work was taking the form in the vernacular language as sermons, as homiletics, homely, right, as things very close to the original destination of their message. Rich ground. And I am just saying this because I know that a lot of people who look for the poetry and the theology understand, about certain metaphors of earthy, fellahin, peasant type forms of expression, and how they make their presence felt in the language as the language comes to them, you see. Here's an example. Here is a sermon in German by Meister Eckhart, and here it is. He spoke, and as it is written, Meister Eckhart said, "A master says that if every medium were removed between myself and a wall, then I would be at the wall, but not in it. But this is not the case with spiritual things, for with them one thing is always in another. That which receives is the same as that which is received, for it receives nothing other than itself. This is difficult, Whoever understands it has been preached to enough. But now, just a little about the image of the soul. There are many teachers who are of the opinion that this image is born from the will and from knowledge, but this is not the case. Rather, I say that this image is a product of itself, with neither will nor knowledge. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine that a mirror is held up to my face. Whether I wish to or not, with neither will nor knowledge of myself, my image is formed in the mirror. This image does not derive from the mirror, nor from itself. Rather, this image is grounded in the one who gives it its being and its nature. When the mirror is removed from me, then I am no longer imaged in it, for I am myself, this image. Another analogy. When a branch grows from a tree, it bears both the name and the nature of the tree. What grows out is the same as what remains within, and what remains within is the same as what grows out. Thus the branch is an expression of itself. The same is true for the image of the soul. What goes out is the same as what remains within, and what remains within is the same as what goes out. This image is the Son of the Father, and I myself am this image, and this image is wisdom. Therefore God be praised now and forevermore. Amen. May those who do not understand this not be troubled. So it's quite beautiful indeed, especially may those who do not understand this not be troubled. Right, now that's a benediction. What's a benediction, you see? That's a teaching, what's a teaching? But you see how simply it goes. And we can use this and kind of draw some things from it to get, just to put some paint on the canvas of this image in words, which is actually a painting in the mind, which we are making of the milieu of Meister Eckhard, in so many ways, by theme, by reference, by hint, and by image, which is very important, and by analogy, which is very, very important. So I just want to see something here before I go into the concept of analogy. Analogy and image of the soul. Before I go into analogy, let me see the image of the soul. Oh, yes, the image of the soul. Oh, yes, and will and knowledge. This is important, I think. The image of the soul. The image of the soul. This we begin to understand when Meister Eckhart speaks of the image of the soul, that we are in the province of a unique thinker who is not to be confined or defined in the conventional Dominican tradition of thinkers as, someone who's in the orbit of Thomas Aquinas and Aristotle, in that synthesis of, Greek and Hellenic thought into that Aramaic jive speech, which is part of, the milieu, the language milieu, there is that. But there's also another tradition. There is something coming uniquely, actually German, in German Dominican, not circles, but there's a certain strain or strand or trend that you can detect, which appears, and a lot of the times we just see it, and then we just kind of note it, and then we see it flower later on in other mystical traditions, right? In the various religious traditions of the world, we see them appearing and reappearing like fish flashing on the surface of a vast and deep sea, like an image, a reflection upon the face of the deep. It's like this. So yeah, Dietrich of Freiburg and Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, justly celebrated and titled. These are these formative Dominican scholars who, with their encyclopedic and synthesizing kind of power, of intellect, are able to bring in certain extremely fructifying and fertilizing influences as part of the tradition that they are teaching in this Dominican line of succession, which travels through time and through generations and flowers sometimes in unique and spiritually enriching ways. And so, Dietrich of Freiburg and Albertus Magnus, with their encyclopedic and synthesizing knowledge and questing and enriching of a vast and fructifying teaching tradition, also made available to the mind of Meister Eckhart the great thoughts from the minds of Proclus the Neoplatonist, and Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, as he is known in the West, the Islamic visionary scholastic and polymath and synthesizer of not only the Aristotelian texts, which were so formative to the persona of Thomas Aquinas, but also, the Neoplatonic texts and their roots in earlier forms of wisdom and things that became, Ibn Sina, Avicenna too was a synthesizer. Anyway, Proclus, the Neoplatonist, a synthesizer of gods with archaic kind of visionary religious systems from people like Heraclitus. And of course, through the great Plato, Proclus, the Neoplatonist philosopher, Avicenna, and Maimonides, who wrote the Guide for the Perplexed, a vast work, identified so often, with that kind of Aristotelian kind of scholastic medieval ecumenical, right, like polymath kind of tradition that comes out of parts of Europe at certain times, where Islam and Jewish and Christian influences are cross-fertilizing each other in all these mysterious ways, Anyway, these are brought in, and this is part of, through some of these Dominicans who taught, in these places where Meister Eckhart was educated as part of his formation. As a young Dominican, he had access to a great deal of sources of learning, archives and libraries and teachers and academies and groves, and cloisters that are less available to some of the other thinkers who are out there who have contributed, in wildly different ways. But anyway, Meister Eckhart, he's an inheritor of a very, very rich tradition, and trained, as well as inspired by all the classical disciplines, rhetoric and grammar and philology and theology. And let me mention Peter Lombard. Was that his name? Lombard was in his name, who wrote the sentences. If you were a reader of the sentences in Paris, you were probably reading the sentences of Peter of Lombard, if that's his name. Peter of Lombard, who wrote these, kind of all about everything, kind of intermediate theological texts, which contain the basic formations and expressions of all these knots and nodes of whirling energy of theological thought, and put into sentences to read and to turn the pages. And for this to be part of the way that your mind was moving in the world, the action of the reading eye, the action of the hand turning the page, but also the training in homiletics, the training in embodying the word in the actual present moment of flesh and blood, bringing forth, the word which is, brought forth and yet remains within, as he mentioned in there. So anyway, and so did I mention Augustine? Perhaps I have not. St. Augustine, the one you might have dreamed you saw. Well, you can always read his book, and his many books, but I'm referring to his autobiography, because there you see, actual tellings of experience and sequences of time and space moments in which a soul, goes astray, is lost, and is found, and is discovered, and works, and toils, and achieves, and fails, and anguishes, and you see all of this, but it's the imaginative vision of it is such that it's as if seeing it under the eye of eternity as well, you see. And that's Augustine, and that too. Well, why do I mention that? Well, there's every reason to mention it when you're talking about Meister Eckhart, when you're talking about such a spiritual precursor as St. Augustine. But also, why is it that Dietrich of Freiburg and Albertus Magnus, their writings survive, but not their sermons, it is said. But Meister Eckhart's do. And there's a reason for that, because there's a recognition that's real clear at the time that there is this element of personal, an energy of personal fervor is present in these writings, without which the metaphors so rich would not flow, would not appear. It's part of the style. So we go from there to a mention of Meister Eckhart as a stylist, as an inheritor of all these language forms, and as a stylist, as a worker into, flowing sentences that, in a very natural way, handle the fruits of all this learning, in a very natural and striking and original way, bring forth new simplicities that anyone could understand. Because in a certain sense, that's part of the appeal of any art form, and the sermon in particular ways, but the appeal being the language that anyone could understand. And that, of course, lends a great stylistic freedom and release that might not be seen in, the scholastics with their, the reputations, are such that, the language is more of a solitary nature, whereas this other kind of communal form of the language opens it up in a totally different way. We have to thank Meister Eckhart, for that, for bringing that out. But this is like a surface and a rhetoric and a style and a skill and a virtuosity. But at the same time, there are these deeper themes like the soul, the theory of analogy, so important, to medieval thinkers, the nature of being, the ground of being, and the beautiful and important and formative idea, the ground of the soul, which Meister Eckhart, that's a melody he picked up from St. Augustine, and then he proceeds to weave his own symphony around that, the ground of the soul, which is allows us to bring in our own metaphors of gardening or agriculture or artistry. It helps us a lot when we have access to certain kind of real simple kind of analogies. So there he speaks of the ground of the soul. I believe he does. There he speaks of the image of the soul. The image of the soul. That's an important word always to understand, but Meister Eckhart is an open light upon this notion of the image and the way it relates to the inner meaning of things. So there's the notion of that. There's the notion of the distance and the nearness, and how in spiritual matters, the Aristotelian, inductions and subtractions and notions of quantity are not at play so much, because no matter how close we are to the wall, we are still to the wall, not in the wall or through the wall, and so in the spirit, in the soul, then matters are different. And he says, things are part of other things. Isn't this what he says? Things are mixed together in this world of multiplicity, right? In this metropolis, in this municipality, which has the word unity in it, unicity, municipality. And at the same time, the metropolis, scattered and far and distant and numerous people. So in that sense, what I'm saying is that all things are present in the soul, right? Is that the image? Is that the image? Am I saying to you that an image of the soul's multiplicity in a communicative form in dialogic and dialectical form, an image of the soul's multiplicity is the city? I would say yes. I would say an image of the soul's multiplicity in the imagination is an image of the city, I would say. And so, we can, just, that's basically true. But, so there's that. So things are mingled together in the soul. And then, but he goes from there to the idea of the image, right? And the image of the soul. And it seems that he wants to correct a certain kind of previous teaching. This is important. This is how the stream turns, This is how the wave breaks and comes together again in the ways that it needs to, according to the demands, the fluctuating demands of gravity and the terrain through which the river is flowing. So some teachings have it that the image of the soul, the person is made receptive to the image of the soul by means of knowledge, by means of will. But Meister Eckhard says this is not the case. And he offers us an analogy. So let's just mention quickly the analogy, the medieval theories of the analogy, which are so important. Meister Eckhart's expression of that is a gift to us. But how can I explain it? Well, it's like the things of the world are the things of the world, and the things of God are the things of God. The things of the world come from God. The things of God are things that are the world, you see. And yet, they are not God. They are of God, and God is in them, and they are in God. So you see, we have to say right away that the things of the world and the things of God are not the same. And yet, they are not different either. It is just that they have a relationship to each other that we must express through images and language and simile and parallel, you see. So it's the language then becomes the axis between these two worlds, you see, which may otherwise be inexplicable to each other, yet intimately related. You see, this is what they speak of when they speak of, the theory of analogy. But Meister Eckhart, this is a sermon in the vernacular. So he doesn't say what I just said. Meister Eckhart offers us a real and useful analogy for the image of the soul, and also to refute the teachings that it is a matter of will and knowledge that makes the soul receptive to the image of itself, which it needs, in order to understand the nature of the divinity. But it is the reflection in the mirror. He offers us amid a world of fast-moving things, amid a world of many, many forms in transit. He offers us the image of the mirror, you see. The image of your own face, and a mirror you hold in your own hand, and you look at it and you see it. And it is there. And is it made by your will and your knowledge? No. It is there because it is the image that it is in the nature of the mirror to reflect. It is there in this way. And when you move the mirror away, it is no longer there. And yet it is an image, and it is itself, and it exists according to its own laws and ways. And yet its source is not in itself. A mirror does not reflect what is not there to be reflected. The images that it reflects are what are presented to its capacity to reflect. You see, and in this way we can understand the image, of the soul. You see, and then he offers another analogy, and this analogy is rooted, literally rooted, in the earth. The analogy of the tree and the branch of the tree. You see, the branch and the tree are, they are one, and yet the branch is one in itself, and the tree is one in itself, but the life of the tree and the life of the branch are one life, and yet there is a branch and there is a tree. Anyway, so he goes from there, and then one final, more conceptual analogy. He says that the word, is it the word he speaks of, or his expression of the image, or so it's part of me now, Meister Eckhart's thought is part of me, so I'm not sure quite how it's reflected, you know, in this when I say that the tree and the branch of the tree are each, they each live in their own sense, as their own word, but that's not quite what I was getting at. It was something having to do, yes, with the expression or the utterance within. Right. Oh, yes, the utterances that go out and yet remain within. This is what I'm talking about. This is the further conceptual analogy in speech, in the intellect, in the soul, in consciousness. That which goes forth and yet is within it still, because the meaning is what gives rise to the form in that moment, you see. And this is how we are to understand the fructifying, creative nature of the soul, which is in itself, is an image of the one, which is another aspect, of Meister Eckhart. When he speaks of, this is part of his Neoplatonist inheritance, is it? But it's also part of an original visionary understanding in himself of the one. We speak of God as the one, and we are free to do this, in space and time. But when we say this, we say the one, and when we say the one, if we mean the one, when we say the one, we're speaking of something that is indivisible in itself. And nothing can be apart from it without it being the one. It's even, you would not even speak of it as an it, because how can there be something apart from it if it is the one and indivisible, you see? And Meister Eckhart says, if you do not understand this, do not be troubled by it, because who understands it? We don't understand it, but we still, we hear, the key it's in, so to speak, We don't argue about the existence of the G minor scale, for example, whether it exists or not, though we cannot see it with our eyes, When we hear it with our ears, or is that what we are doing? Or is it more like we are hearing something that we cast into it, cast our sight into it to look for its origins, and we see that it is like in the key of G minor, and I would have to ask, does that mean that that's the formation of the telephone lines that the birds fly off of? Is not the key or the scale or what have you, of G minor, is that not actually an abstraction, in and of itself? We can argue about this endlessly, and right, I'm actually arguing by analogy about the futility. Well, not the futility, but the it's not all that creative to argue about the nature of, does God exist or does God not exist? And that's at one time, in some place, it may be, it may be a creative thing to do. That's part of the nature of the divinity, it brings us, it puts these questions to us. But now, Proclus said that the one is understood by consciousness in the flight of ecstasy, when consciousness is outside of itself, ecstasy being outside of itself, so that, so that there is no boundary, there is no separation. But you see, this is a gift of a certain state of mind. We say, not being in that state of mind, And if we attempt to fly toward that state of mind through will and knowledge, Meister Eckhart would remind us that this is an erroneous teaching, you see. And so, it's kind of like that. But so, and yet there's a certain form I want to mention, having mentioned the G minor scale, and the strangeness of arguing about the nature of whether or not it exists as distinct from understanding it in its manifestations, which is music to our ears. There's that. Also, the futility of the argument, about, as Walt Whitman said, argue not concerning God. So, so the arguments that I speak of, the dialectical kind of nature of them, that's just a dramatic skin that they shed. And because it's a different form of understanding, that we approach here. So the G minor scale, the notion of the deity. Okay, well now, what about this traditional notion, which is, it is of the folk tradition. It is of the universal folk tradition. I'm talking about the Trinity, right? And I'm talking about specifically the Trinity in, this Christian mysticism, and its importance as a doctrine. That's one thing now, and we have to talk about a certain kind of really jagged juxtaposition of Meister Eckhart and the external doctrines. We have to talk about that, but let us also keep in mind, though, that this notion of the Trinity, the three gunas, right? In India, what are the three gunas? Sattvas, which is harmony, rajas, which is acceleration, which is upwardness, which is fieriness, and tamas, which is, right, descent or gravity or falling or decay or decadence. These three gunas, these three strands make up, the flowing of time, you see. We see the three prongs of the devil's pitchfork. Provocation, intimidation, and seduction. We see that as a mirror image, from the, Baroque imagination of someone like Bosch, we might say. But we see also the Trinity now, the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And very important in the poetic analogic thought of Meister Eckhart, because these things are in constant transformation into and out of each other. And in this way, we can sort of understand, the nature of the deity. So, and Meister Eckhart speaks often of the utterance of God in the ground of the soul. The utterance of God in the ground of the soul is the Father. And the Father's utterance is the Son. And the Son is in the Father because things go out and remain within. And the Father is in the Son because things remain within yet go out, remain in. And so you see there is this kind of like, there's this birth, to speak of an earthy image. There is this birth that is given to in the ground of the soul conceptually through God utters, you see. And from that utterance is born the logos, the Son, or the meaning, you see. And there's another important Trinity I've got to get to. But, okay. But what about then? What about the third one? What about the ghost? What about the Holy Spirit? What would we say about this? What would Meister Eckhart say about this? There is the fact that they are the image, that they are images, you see. There is the fact that the image that God speaks in the soul is the image of the Father. There is the fact that the image cast in the mirror of the ground of the soul is the image of the soul. There's the fact then that they are images. There is the fact that they are visionary presentations inhabiting the world that their origination has created, and being of that and in that, and yet as themselves they are not that. They are that, but the understanding of that principle is brings us back to the one, right? Where all roads begin and end, you might say. But also, see how they wind and twist and run parallel to each other. This too, right, is an analogy that Meister Eckhart, brings us to. So there's that important Trinity, which is important kind of as a reference point for your for the birth and growth of his thought. the birth and growth of his thought in these metaphors, which of course we can appreciate, without investing ourselves, ignorantly, right, in some of the doctrinal heat, or some of the argumentative heat, or some of the social conflicts that exist, in this other realm. People want to jump into those and define this field without understanding. Well, things are not necessarily as they seem. When we're talking about these kind of expressions, which are of real realities, you see. So I just want to mention, though, and it's important, I think, this other Trinity, which is also important, and that is, it comes to us from this scholastic, kind of rich fountain, which it's up to us, of course, how we are to understand it in a creative way, rather than simply believing it, in a surface kind of way, which is, that's not what we're talking about here, and that's not what it demands of us, of course. But this is something that could be true. But yeah, so this other Trinity then. So yeah, what I'm speaking of can also be spoken of. The birth of meaning, and the ways we come to understand and appreciate meaning, which we can point to things, we can point to ideas, we can point to concepts, we can speak words. But what makes them this in their real existence, is the energy of meaning, you could say. And this is the Logos. This is the image. The fact that the image is the image is a sign of the Holy Ghost, and the meaning of this is a gift of the Logos. The Logos is meaning, you see. The Logos is meaning, but we could even just, it can be expressed in any terms we that are appropriate to it, and a secular term appropriate to the notion of meaning is content. This is content, right? This is meaning, right? This is Logos. This is one element, but there's two other elements that are important, you see. The Dominicans probably learned this, because this is like the inner architecture, of the philosophy of their embodying their message, which is speech, in a certain sense. So they know this. This is classic. There's the Logos, there's the meaning, there's the content. That's 1/3. There's also this other. This is the Greek word is ethos. And this is credibility, you might say. This is, actually, there's a lot of ways you could understand it. Not all the ways, but because of the timely nature of some of these terms, some of the terms are misleading when we speak of something like credibility, the very word itself. So let's be more specific about that. Credibility is that, ethos is that's what inspires trust. That's what one puts one's faith. One puts one's faith in is part of the domain of what ethos tries to encompass. Notions of like character and trustworthiness, basically. This is kind of ethos is like trustworthiness. Let's say that. So Logos is meaning, content. Ethos is trustworthiness, and this, of course, has to do with the one who is embodying the Logos, which is an individual, which is the person. It's kind of like the theology of the person, of the incarnation. You see, all these things, you can just see there's tiny little, we see sparks from the wheel, and we know these wheels that have always turned, but, what we might need to be reminded of is the sparks are ever anew, and they fall to us, and they have a meaning to us, And anyway, so what's this third thing? Pathos. The third thing is pathos. There is Logos, there is ethos, and there is pathos. Pathos, of course. Well, immediately, pathos, right? Pathos does mean pain. Pathos also means passion. Oh, don't we love that one? But passion means pain. Pathos, pain, pathetic, all of this stuff. Sympathetic. When we jump to go over to the costume department, the semantic or the lexical costume department and look at sympathetic sympathy. Ooh, that's loaded though, a bit sentimental. Let's let's turn a page in the costume department, of some of this and see, compassion, feeling with, right? Compassion, passion, pathos, right? So there's this, trustworthiness is what elicits trust, okay? Compassion is how trustworthiness is realized, when you feel with that which you have invested trust in, when you feel with what makes it possible, pathos in the speech act, What makes it meaningful, logos. What makes it attractive or stylistic is ethos. What makes it legitimate is ethos. What makes it a certain standard, of external elan, that's also ethos. That's Meister Eckhart in his rhetorical gift, you see, which can create, stylistic beauty, from, stodgy Latin terms and bring it forward to the people, with great panache, and so this is kind of like, this is all these things, are what make, the phenomena of Meister Eckhart and his gift to us. All these things are part of what makes that possible. So now, we speak then of pain. We speak of passion. We speak of compassion. We spoke, I think, of activity and action. We spoke of, I know that we prefigured it, but, I want to say this, this is what they used to say, this is one of the lessons of the 1960s, in places like Berkeley, is the hippies have the keys, but they don't know how to use them. The activists, they know how to use the keys, but they don't have them, you see. By analogy, this is the way we can speak of the mystic and the world, the secular authority, the worldly authority, doesn't have to be secular, of course. The power, we could speak of the power, right. The power to act, activist, acting, because, there is that in this metropolis. And the way that the metropolis works, in the horizontal way that I'm referring to now, with its laws and its courts and its jurisdictions and its conflicts and its ideologies and its legitimate forms of discourse and its legitimate forms of representation and its shoddy standards, of ethos and logos and pathos, of course, and these, manipulated standards, which are, the chaos of living in a world of images without knowing that they are images and without having an understanding of what the image is and what is an image of what is true and what is an image of what is not true and what is it that is the image is being made, what is it of it that as we understand that we come to understand the nature of consciousness, which is the nature, which is intellect, which is soul, which is all of this. Instead, we can live our lives chained, to from image to image, without being, able to get out of it, possessed by this pathos, without having access to the meaning of it or the sweetness of it. What I'm saying? Like Buddha speaks of dukkha, which is suffering, but there is also sukha, which is sweetness. Our word sucrose comes from it, right? And that is, there is beauty. That's what I'm saying. There's beauty in all of this. But no, caught in the world of the images, the beauty that is of the images doesn't ring true, right? And people suffer from this without realizing it. But more than that, people misapprehend ideas that they had best be understanding. And yet, societies move in this way, careers move in this way, personas move in this way, human beings live their lives in this way. Why is it so important on the level of pathos to speak of it in the story of Meister Eckhart? Well, the drama of it is, it happened with Meister Eckhart, or this dramatic element existed in the story of Meister Eckhart as it does in the story of Socrates who drank the hemlock, as it does in the story of Christ who died on the cross, as it does in the story of Halaj, who was brutally treated in the town square. Again and again and again, there's this notion of this punishment that is meted out, this unjust punishment that is meted out because of a misapprehension of what the individual is bringing to the culture, you see, because it's taking place in the midst of many kinds of different power struggles. So what I'm saying is, how did Meister Eckhart respond to the accusations of heresy? How did this Dominican, who was of the order that actually administrated the original Inquisition when it was known by that name, right, in southern France, 100 years or so before him, the only Dominican, obviously the first and only Dominican to be brought before the Inquisition, right? These are terms which we, loaded terms which, the details, the more you look at the details, the more details there are and the more ways you can parse out what really was happening. So I'm going to offer an interpretation of what was really happening according to my own lights, which have been a long time trying to emerge, from the murkiness of my, murky thought, What did happen? How was it, that Meister Eckhart, how comes it that Meister Eckhart, speaking in these sublime terms, can be brought before, the tribunal of judgment with possible dire consequences in terms of punishments and things, not to mention the injustice of it or the folly of it, right? Well, and so how can this be understood? Well, it's such a loaded thing. I wonder if I can just say just what I can, to understand it, if I do understand it, and that is that there was this movement that was defined by some bishops, and imagine a chessboard, right? Each chess piece is its own center of power, and the bishop is close to the king and the queen, right? And so it's a certain power center, but why is it that monks look like pawns? Or it's what I'm saying is that the bishops are only one of many centers of power and energy of activity, horizontal, image-based, image-limited, image-confined, morality in this metropolis, of Paris and Strasbourg and Cologne and Avignon, because this is where the Holy See was for a little while, 100 years or something. The Pope lived at Avignon. And so, the Pope lived at Avignon and wanted to bring the office back to Rome, but could not for many reasons. But there was a Bavarian principality, a certain, king in Bavaria who had designs on Italy, and the Pope did not want this to happen. And so the Pope did what the Pope could to deprive this principality of its power, to extend itself into Italy so that the return to Rome would have to be postponed. And so the Pope excommunicated this particular Bavarian king or prince or ruler. And but there needed to be allies for this. And just like on the chessboard, important allies, of the various kings and principalities and powers might be in the ecclesiastical ones. And so there were these bishops, the bishop of Cologne, I believe, Henry, was his name Henry? The bishop of Cologne wanted certain rights to collect toll fees and supported a certain Habsburg would-be ruler in Bavaria, and because of this became an ally of the Pope. So the Pope, through many appeals became indebted to this particular bishop in Cologne. But also at the same time, this bishop and others, there was this, kind of ideological thing. This was, before they would be described as ideologies. And I wonder what Hannah Arendt would say about these kind of ecclesiastical forms. I think it's very, I would love it for people to understand more about this, or to be able to open up their minds a little bit to what's going on with this kind of thing, because I don't know, I just think it would be good. That's me being, polemical or something like that. But there was this feeling, there was this ideology, for lack of a better word, idea, logos, false logos, right? But there was this animus, this antagonism, this enmity toward this loosely defined, vaguely defined, but loadedly defined heresy called something like the movement of the free spirit, the fellowship of the free spirit. This was the abstract, diffuse kind of threat seen by these bishops. This heresy, this particular form of heresy, of the fellowship of the free spirit, which seemed to find a harbor in these communities of lay women called the Beguines. Now, there's a history there for you, and there's a whole current, very, very rich, these loosely affiliated orders, religious communities, founded with the ideal and the mission and the understanding, of the deepest compassion, and then the understanding of the truth and its action in the world, and the incarnation of goodness in the world, and the actions that it would do in the world, And so that they were communities and fellowships, but their organization was outside of the bounds, of the quote unquote official ecclesiastical structures. And so because of this, and also, that's where the personal energies and the personal expressions and those kind of flavors of individuals who are expressing what is within themselves, and the language of the people, and the analogies, and the procedures of imagery and expression and persuasion, the ethos, the ethos among the laity, among the people, is one of like goodness authenticated on the street, an everyday person, in the way that an everyday person could kind of understand, much like, the vernacular speech of the sermons of Meister Eckhard, you see. But for some reason related to politics, interpersonal rivalries, career conflicts of careerists, these opportunists, intellectually, knowing only the world of horizontal social images, seemed to harbor within themselves the notion that the Beguines, these lay communities, were harboring this heresy of the free spirit, harboring it in people, or in writings, or in thoughts, or in ideologies. They don't have to say. They don't have to point out to individuals, which is probably good, and also, allows it to become, diffuse and highly general. But there was this suspicion of heresy, and it was officially promulgated in a certain council when Meister Eckhart was, in his 50s, I think, and by then, he'd held the chair of theology in Paris twice, something that only Aquinas before him had done. And he'd also been a very skilled and popular administrator, as prior of the Dominican house in Erfurt, his hometown in Germany, but also in Saxonia, and also Strasbourg, which I think is near to Cologne, and certain areas where he's in these administrative roles. But then, of course, there comes the time when especially with the vernacular sermons, the preaching consists, as I read a sample of earlier, of analogies and metaphors, mirrors, and trees, and language that is so simple and yet, so exemplifying this nobility of thought that people take the ball and run with it, They're metaphors, they're symbols, they're of sublime things, of ideas that are graspable to the intellect in only the most kind of disciplined yet free metaphorical kind of ways. And as such, they're subject to misinterpretation. And this can be dangerous in medieval times in a certain particular way. This can lead to charges of like, what? Meister Eckhart, do you mean to say, that a soul in union with God is free of the distinctions between conventional good and evil? This is rank heresy, most foul. And so, and of course, There's also, this is the way, Pope, I'm scratching your back. No, this was the way the Pope was scratching the Bishop of Cologne's back, because it was the Bishop of Cologne. There was the Pope who just wanted the allyship, and therefore, with the influence, that the Pope would have on the judicial structures, when Meister Eckhart was summoned, to Cologne before the Inquisition, to defend himself against these charges of, theological error. Heresy is like it's a finely terrorist kind of field of accusation, and there has to be intention. It can't just be a controversial preacher preaching error. You could be subject to, harsh examination, but for heresy, it has to be, much more specific, with this notion of intention. And for Henry, the Bishop of Cologne, it was good enough to initiate proceedings. And Meister Eckhart did not speak of his teachings as being an addition, something added to the church. He did not defend it, or however you might, saying it was a correction of the teachings of the church. No. But with his style of flowing and insightful reasoning, he explained that it was perfectly within the orthodox traditions of the church, albeit delivered with great rhetorical style and with, startling and striking metaphors and analogies, and in order to evoke, a reality which is constantly fertile and creating images of itself within. And there, in preaching, one seeks to catch the thoughts on the wing, as the speech is being formed in the place where one stands. And as such, to, particularize in such a crude way with political intent in order to justify one's animus, to justify one's accusation, one's charges, one's misjudgment of heresy. Why? Meister Eckhart, before the Inquisition, explained, and the writings are there to be perused, and they're edifying, because it was his nature to be a teacher, and so he taught, and so, he was already, influent, had a reputation such that, he was vulnerable, but there were people there, among the Dominicans who were there with him, who appeared alongside him, so that the case was referred to Avignon. The case was referred to before the courts there, where the Holy See was located. And there, if only the Pope had not been kind of politically indebted to these bishops, specifically the one in Cologne, if he hadn't been kind of indebted to them, the case would have just been set aside. But instead, it was allowed to process. The charges were kind of reduced. Eventually there were 28 declarations, and the thing is, Meister Eckhart passed away before before this was resolved in any kind of external way. But then, oddly enough, actually, after he had passed away, shortly after, within like a year or something, a papal bull, Agro Dominico, that's the title in Latin, was promulgated, I guess that you say, or was pronounced, and which did use the word Meister Eckhart along with the word heresy, but he had already died. And this is strange. It's unprecedented, and see, it's just it shows you an example of how actually it was just more a product of the politics of the times rather than something that anybody was really committed to, except the people who were in the wrong, the Bishop of Cologne. But the pronunciation, the papal bull Agro Dominico, was pronounced, and only in Cologne, and only after Meister Eckhart had passed on. Only in Cologne. in no other place. And this is not how things are done normally. So you can see it was just kind of like a piece of meal, kind of like what? I don't know, way to humor someone. I'm not sure. But it did not matter, actually, as I understand it. It couldn't matter in the long run because otherwise we wouldn't be talking about it now. But and it did not matter in the short run, actually, because just a short time later there was a flowering of mystical thought among Dominicans who had actually been around Meister Eckhart and who'd actually undoubtedly been taught by him. John Tauler and Henry Suso. And they times were a little bit different, and I don't think that they had to have the pressure of the accusation of heresy for them. So they had a whole lifetime later on to continue to appreciate and formulate in writing an understanding of the thought of Meister Eckhart. And this contributed to a flowering in the Rhineland that they speak of, the Rhineland mystics. And eventually the Flemish mystics, what's his name? Jan Ruschenbeck, I believe his name was, Jan Ruschenbeck, whose language was very warm and very poetic. I'm not sure what ecclesiastical position he had, but he was miles away and far away from some of these controversies. So he had the chance to write beautifully metaphorical and extravagant kind of teachings about the nature of the unity, of the Holy Spirit and the human being, and the nature of wisdom and divinity and all of this without being under threat, and also, but stylistically to be quite wild, I mean, it's all, you could say it in all these different ways, but so it is mentioned because it is to be mentioned, that this is part of the social background of this thought, that brought into play, and undoubtedly it was very much a part of the being the persona of Meister Eckhart, through whom, this great body of creative thought has come, that the social and dramatic background in the metropolis, is there with the accusations of heresy, that kind of conflict, oh, it'd make a great movie, would it? It could also make a crummy movie, but it does exist as a movie in the minds of those who ponder its meaning, because it is there for a purpose. The story of Meister Eckhart is there for a purpose, and so that's part of it. But there's also, we can look at his thought in the language that he used, and the way that it's expressed, in the rhetoric, right, in the ethos of it, what attracts you to it aesthetically, maybe, but also in the logos of it, in the inner meaning of it, because as well as this rhetorical surface richness, there's the depth, and the sublimity of the spaces within where these inklings first take root, or first where the seed first breaks, where they begin to flower, long before they become, conventional beliefs. Rather, it's like the branch of a tree, part of the tree of revelation, the branches, are there to bring forth leaves and blossoms. They are there as places for birds to rest. They are there to give shade and comfort to the weary traveler. They grow the leaves for the wind to blow through to make the rustling noises and to provide us with metaphors, right? Because, of the tree of the inner understanding, of the source of religious expressions. The leaves of that tree that blow in the wind make a beautiful sound that we can listen to with our ears and hear what our ears do not hear. Where we can look at the leaves of the trees and see them turn. And it's no accident that leaves of a tree, leaves of a book, right? Leaves of a book. Another word for pages is leaves. Leaves of grass, as Walt Whitman spoke of, the one who counseled us at the beginning to argue not concerning God, you see. Ah, yes, Walt Whitman had an open road, And let me take back something I said earlier when I said, you will not hear me mention Hegel after the title of that poem I wrote and read to you back there earlier, from Hegel to Birmingham. There I've said the word Hegel twice more. But why? Because when I speak of, Walt Whitman and the open road, I want to mention how Whitman has something to say about Hegel, and of the sinuousness. Well, I don't remember exactly what words he uses, when he heard, the learned astronomer and all this. But in his prose, he speaks of Hegel, and he speaks of this vast and moving superstructure, of thought, which is, it's actually, the truth is, um, it's a similar kind of gift to what Whitman embodies in his long line. And Whitman, he loves opera, and he loves the strophes, the sentences, the verse, the prose verse structure, of the scriptures. And his lines are long with many vertebra and many loose interstices. But this is the way it is with the nature of speech also, as it is brought forth into the world and into society. And because of this, though, those vertebra, there's the armor, but the armor needs to move to accommodate the movement of what the armor protects. And so there's a lot of interstices between the armor plates, all these open positions, which are vulnerabilities, which are there, as the thing turns, like a river, and, it is there that form, existing as a cultural bearer, is vulnerable in certain ways, to certain kinds of misapprehension, right? And so we can see that in Meister Eckhard also. Let me check the time here to tell you, there's some time now to offer a different kind of way of understanding. Well, not exactly a different kind of way of understanding Meister Eckhart, but just rather to see thoughts, to see some thoughts. I want to see some thoughts. I want to catch some fish, And what I'm saying is this, but first let me, it diffuses the green tea, sencha, green tea diffuses, into the warm water and soothes the inner being, and there has to be a pause for that, the springs, the springs are, their nature is to be desirous of replenishment and renewal. So, yes, thoughts are fish, our minds are the ocean, by way of analogy, And so we can look at some thoughts just in and of themselves of Meister Eckhart, because this is the way that the writing can be taken. This is very important too, because in Meister Eckhart, I have to say, it's just, I so appreciate it when the energy, of a writer's mental gift can encompass, the thoroughness of the treatise and all the forms of, observational style that are, that which bear fruit in the literary form of the treatise, dense prose, which lives according to the detail that it gathers and moves and goes along. And as Meister Eckhart said in that thing that I read back at the beginning, what was it now? In spiritual matters, there really aren't those walls separating one thing from another. You see, all words share the logos to the extent that they have meaning, share a logos to the extent that they have meaning, and each word is different, each thought is different. And yet that which makes it what it is ever the same. It is that in itself, which is that principle, that quality in it. We can only approach the mystery of this, right, through coming to appreciate the nature of parable and analogy and image and all of this. Anyway, and yet we are vulnerable creatures. Between our plates of armor, we are vulnerable. We are vulnerable because we need water. We need nourishment, And we know what it's like to go without these things, because it's a world of time and space where things are like fragmented from themselves, except within to the eye of vision, which must be educated and developed, right? We are born ignorant and educated to become more so, as Thomas Horace said. But there is also true education, which is there, which is there, like water, like rain, like bread, like nourishment. Anyway, so here's a quote. So what I'm saying is, thoughts, fish in the ocean of the mind. It's devotional style of writing. Meister Eckhart is also writing in the form of the treatise, and also in the form of all the forms within the form of the sermon. Parable, folktale, metaphor, analogy, all of it. It's all there. It's a rich thing being handed down, but it's also designed It flourished in this way because that's how Meister Eckhart was educated and learned, and how his own devotional life was. And that is, the utterances are thoughts in and of themselves, and they can be kept as such in the mind, in bite-sized pieces. This nourishment can be taken this way. Nourishment needs to be taken this way in portions appropriate, right? So that if we don't understand, we need not be troubled, because we can look at it kind of in more appropriate portions, like thoughts. For example, this from Meister Eckhart. What keeps us alive? What allows us to endure? I think it is the hope of loving or being loved. I heard a fable once about the sun going on a journey to find its source, and how the moon wept without her lover's warm gaze. We weep when light does not reach our hearts. We wither like fields if someone close does not rain their kindness upon us. You see, so there's all the metaphors of the earth there, is there not? There's the sun, there's the moon, there's the rain, there's the field. There's the longing, there's the other. There's the notion of kindness. But what goes forth is also within, you see. But here, this is an expression of that. I just want to say what goes forth is also within. Here's where even that little thought, that simple thought, he says, I heard a fable once about the sun going on a journey to find its source, and the moon wept to be without the loved one near. The sun went on a journey to find its source. The sun is its own source. We are the source of the sun. So the sun goes on a journey to find its source. This is almost, this is funny. The sun is the source of itself. It is within itself. Did the sun come from somewhere else? No. But the sun went on a journey. Oh, the sun moves. This thing that is the source of itself, how could it move? Well, it does. And what misses it when it does? The moon, its reflection. In other words, the reflection, the image, longs for its source and knows it is of its nature as a mirror, be it moon or actual mirror, to reflect only that which is present to it. And, what is present is in a state of change in this world. And it puts the path in pathos, does it not? And yet it's given in the form of a fable. It's whole and complete and aesthetically pleasing, so that when we hear it, we can trust it. And as its ethos, this fable, it's trustworthy to us. And because of that, it will return. It will offer increase. It will reward us for the attention that we pay to it. So in that way, there's the pathos, and there's the ethos. And then there's the logos, which, though it appears in analogy, sun and moon and all of this stuff, there is that which we draw from it, as an image, of the wisdom in the soul of the utterance, you see, because it is an utterance. Offered to us, we can share it, and we sort of just have, you might say it's in the nature of things that it be this way. So there's that. And here's another thought. God flows inside creatures. God's divinity depends on the power to share with whatever is able to receive this divinity. Flows and shares, right? Flows and shares. So you see, utterances like that, then how can you capture it in the cage of rightful doctrine? When you understand that it moves in this way. You see how something like this, strange how it can run afoul and be so, misappropriated by principalities and powers, chained, in the horizontal traps of image and illusion. Well, It can be this way, but don't fret about that. If you do not understand this, do not be troubled by it, because in and of itself it is true. God flows inside creatures. God gives of God's self to whoever is receptive to it. It's the energy of attention. It's the energy of meaning. Let's put it into those terms. The energy of attention and the energy of meaning are in this reciprocal kind of like unfathomable, relationship. But it is dynamic. And yet, it has its moments of stillness as well. If it did not have stillness, it would not be dynamic. If it did not have stasis, it would not be moving. It's action as well as meaning. It's all of this. Anyway, and so let me just say this. And this is classic. This is here in Meister Eckhart's utterance, which no doubt, was uttered by many, many before. Most originally, by the Creator, according to the scriptures of many, many a religion. But you see this in Emerson and many others, because it's an analogy offered to us by a very human faculty, which we speak of in the image of sight. Right? It is sight through which images are apprehended, through which images are cast as well. And then let us also nod, to William Blake, who said, you are led to believe a lie when one sees not through, but with the eye. We are admonished to see through the eye so that we can understand this, not be caught up in the images, in the horizontal nature of the images, which is actually an understanding of the images to understand the entirety of, by way of analogy, by way of the path, of learning. But anyway, so this is the quote from Meister Eckhart, which, the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love. So you see, that inspires many things, many songs. But it's simply true, many seeings. But anyway, so let me just say this then. The eye through which God sees me is the eye through which I see God. And there's one seeing, one knowledge, one love. I mean, it's taught, before Meister Eckhart, when they speak of the soul as being intellect, they don't mean intellect the way that we now mean intellect, being smart, They mean more like what we might know now as consciousness, And they might mean it more like there's also that aspect, the ground of the soul, and there's also that aspect where it is this intellect, this soul, is, the image, it receives the image as a reflection, but it's also actualized by knowledge, right? The intellect is actualized by knowledge. The intellect knows itself in its action, the action agent, the agency of the intellect. That's kind of from, Aristotle by way of Aquinas. I mean, the vocabulary, I think, is it, but the agent, the intellectual agent is known by knowledge, which is its movement, and but to a greater or lesser degree, depending upon the reality of what it knows, right? The movement, the activity, which is the realization of the intellect, is realized in the reality of that which it knows, which seems to indicate that, it can know something that is not quite real and will be therefore quite less actualized, you see. So then that's how we get to these notions. Okay, then what is real then? What is the foundation of reality? And this is, leads us back into these deeper places. But so, the eye then, does it mean physical sight? It means physical sight as an analogy and source of further analogies, but it means actual inner sight. And so what I'm saying to you is like, it's like this, to put aside, certain kind of argumentative shadows, and to see, and you can do it mythically, or however You can receive it, just as the energy of in the language, just this kind of like a momentary opening, of the vision of what it is to see God. And do you see, an old man in a white beard on a throne, well, in a story, you do. Oh, that's Zeus, for example. No, that's Walt Whitman, you can say. Or, that's Abraham Lincoln, or any number of things, But no, I'm just joking, of course. Do you see, you don't see, a physical form. You don't see something that you could see with your eyes, nor do you see a cruel judge, because this is of the world of form, You see in spirit, and Scripture does say this, you see an abstract quality. You see truth, the source of truth, the source of justice, the source of goodness, the source of beauty, but as the source, which is describable only in terms of analogy, right? It's a dimension. So you are there on the threshold. The eye is a threshold. The eye is a threshold of the understanding of being. And so you see through this threshold, and you see God, but you don't see a form. Oh, but you realize this same threshold is the same through which God sees me. And so you ask yourself, you say to yourself, you recognize that I see God. God sees me. I know this in the seeing. And then, that thought gives birth to an image of a further thought, which is, what does God see when God sees me? Oh, I know how I actually know myself. I know myself as myself, but I do not know myself as others know me. I know that is an image, in the minds of others. I know, poor Narcissus suffered to teach me this, that image that I see in the reflection of life's stream is only an image, but it is not me. I know that I don't know when it comes to myself in myself. Therefore, it is futile to argue about whether or not I exist, just as it is futile to understand whether or not God exists. It's more to the point, the particle in the wave. It's more to the point to bring the point to its origin. Bring the particle to the wave. Bring the drop to the sea. Bring the drop to the sea. The rain is that. The rain is the drop returning to the sea, you see. And Meister Eckhard says, creation is not something that happened a long time ago. Creation always is. Creation always is. What was 1,000 years ago to God is the same as what will be 1,000 years from now, which is the same as what is now, you see. So there's your another trinity for you: past, present, and future. That too, is a form, a triune kind of form. And, there are ways where, we can contemplate that. And there's a few, portals, or a few inklings, as the Quakers call them, inklings, showings, openings, that Meister Eckhard brings for us, and allows us to take a look at. Okay, so, well, I read one poem of my own at the beginning. I want to read a short poem of my own now, and then I will step back for now. And this one shall be called, this one shall be named, did I do this one? Or did I do this one? I did that one, so I will do this one. This is called, there's some, and now perhaps you will recognize some Meister Eckhart kind of terms in this poem. It is called Shadowfuls of Imagined Experience. Fulfill a fantasy of yourself as a jaded realist arriving from yesterday in the key of non sequitur, arguing with nothingness about the scale of G minor as being an actual existent, as a placeholder for lost souls, or some other invention of cosmic power. For a form is a contraption that works in that moment of energy, that particle, that mental mask, otherwise known as a complex or triple compartment battery box of pocket notions of otherwise known by any other atmospheric conjectures, like the voice of cloud shadows as they cross paths upon the ground of the soul. You see, so let the words bring forth the words within the words. Let the thoughts bring forth the thoughts within the thoughts. Oh, because they do, we know that they do. But let us always be aware that just like the sun, and the moon, do what they do, the inner principles, the inner origins, bring forth what they bring forth, and yet they remain within themselves. And how do we know this? Is because it is within us. And so, on that note, let us contemplate that good stuff. And, let us delve into the works of Meister Eckhart and other such poets of the soul, because it's an enriching journey. All right. So I thank you for your heroic listening. And I say to you, so long for now.